Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 115, Thargeen and Tony, Part 2. Midgard and its surroundings were utterly fascinating to Thargeen. For one thing, Midgard was the only realm to have other bodies in orbit around its suns, other than a moon. He found it rather ironic that Midgard shared its sun with 8 other bodies, and a swath of asteroids. 9 bodies, 9 realms. Thargeen wasn't fanciful enough to think it coincidence, but he'd been proven wrong in the past, so who knew? Midgard itself was, to dwarven eyes, very flat. This was not a new phenomenon to Thargeen, or any other dwarf who had traveled to another realm, but he was pleased to note that Midgard did have a few halfway decent, almost mountains, unlike some of the other realms. That aside, it very quickly became obvious that Midgardians were basically non-magical dwarves. Their scans, as they had approached Midgard's area, had picked up a number of crafted artifacts. Some were obviously adrift, powerless, but others were just as obviously still powered and controlled by some means. The closer they got to Midgard itself, the more of such artifacts they encountered, and the more of them were still powered and controlled. Midgard itself was virtually surrounded by the things. They even, as Stark had averred, had an inhabited construct in orbit around Midgard, something none of the other realms had. Moreover, Midgard's biggest cities were a marvel of engineering. Thargeen, Kempana, and Razdan had spent more than a few minutes cooing over some of the buildings their scans picked up. The ones that had been built as much to be art as they had been to be functional, at least going by what they looked like. They teleported to the structure Stark directed them to. Stark, and quite a few others, were waiting for them when they arrived. Thargeen recognized the 2 men, other than Thor and Loki, whom he'd interacted with more than once before the Midgardians showed up with them in tow, that had accompanied Stark in the crowd, though it took a moment to remember their names. More because they hadn't talked to him as much as Stark had than any other reason. In fact, the one soldier they'd called him hadn't spoken at all. "Thargeen! Good to see you," Stark greeted them, then waved a hand. "This is the rest of the gang. Well, almost all of them. One's off doing other things and won't be here until later today, and another will be here in a couple of days as he doesn't live in the tower. Yeah, we're working on that one." Stark grinned in a way that made Thargeen almost feel sorry for whatever was stopping that second person from living in this building. That grin did not bode well for the problem's continued existence. At any rate, Stark continued, then introduced everyone. Thargeen nodded, and Razdan and Kempana both bowed slightly. "Well met, Alia. This is Razdan, our master shipbuilder, and Kempana, our fleet general." Razdan, like most dwarves, was brown of hair and eye. He was, however, tall for a dwarf, nearly able to look Stark in the eye, and on the lean side, comparatively speaking, which had served him well in his chosen career. Even with the aid of magic, it was frequently required to shimmy into a confined space to do something in the construction of a spaceship, and Razdan's somewhat narrower chest and shoulders meant he had an easier time doing such a thing. Kempana was a couple inches shorter than Thargeen. She was also significantly older than either himself or Razdan, who was all of 3,000 years old, while Thargeen was a bit over 4,000. Her hair had long since gone steel gray, and she kept it cropped very short, in a style that would have passed muster in Earth's various militaries, for a man. Her eyes were a shade of hazel that was more green than it was brown. The Avengers, for so Stark had named the group, all offered various greetings. "Right, come on with me and I'll show you your rooms," Stark said. The 3 of them followed Stark into a small room. Stark must have picked up on their curiosity because he grinned. "This is what we call an elevator. We can't teleport from one place to another, so in tall buildings like this one, elevators are the primary way we get from one floor to another." Ah, that made sense. While all but Niflheim had buildings of more than one floor, none needed more than stairs to connect to the various floors, either due to there only being a few floors or because the residents could teleport between floors. "So those small moving constructs we saw on the screens, the ones that kept to certain paths, they're your version of cots?" Razdan asked. All 3 of them had agreed they probably were, but it was best to be sure. Yep, they're called vehicles as a group, but certain styles have their own names. The smallest ones are personal transport, for anywhere from 1 to about 8 people. Some of the mid-sized ones are bulk transport per people, others transport goods. Same for the biggest ones, Stark told them. The elevator opened onto a new level, one with several doors on either side of a long hallway. Going by the spacing of the doors, whatever they led to was fairly sizable, as there were only 2 doors on each side, and the hallway was a good 2 or 3 bars long. Bars, of course, referred to the long-since standardized length of cart rails used when new track was laid. Thargeen had no idea what that length equaled in Midgardian measurements. At least not yet. These are personal quarters, Stark told them and opened one of the doors. The main room was generously sized, Thargeen discovered, and had high ceilings even for someone of Asgardian height, never mind dwarven. Thargeen quickly noticed something interesting, however. Compared to the furniture he'd spotted on the floor they'd teleported to, the furniture here was somewhat smaller and closer to the ground. As if Stark, or whoever, had obtained furniture with dwarven bodies in mind. Fortunately, the built-in parts of the space, like the workspaces in the kitchen, were not an unhandy height for a dwarf. Midgardians were apparently just enough shorter than the other realm residents that the 3 of them wouldn't have to resort to using step stools to reach sinks and the like, though they would still need them to reach all of the storage spaces up on the walls. There are 3 sleeping spaces down that hall, Stark said, pointing down the hallway. So if the 3 of you would rather stay in one set of quarters, you can, or each of you can have your own separate quarters. It would probably be best we all stay in one set of quarters, Thargeen said. It will make it easier for us to consult with each other and compare notes. Stark nodded. Okay, there's I don't know what you call them, but a place to clean up down the hallway too. I probably ought to show you how this stuff works. He led the way and briefly showed them how to work the various structures in the room. Right. Other than that, if you have any questions about how to run something in here, you can ask any of us, or you can talk to Jarvis. He's available at all times. Jarvis, introduce yourself, Stark said. Thargeen was both curious. There was, after all, no one else in the room, and slightly worried, because Stark had a very toothy, anticipatory grin on his face. Tony was not too proud to admit he was looking forward to seeing what the dwarves made of Jarvis. Thus far, only a handful of the Avengers had twigged to anything unusual about Jarvis, as far as Tony and Jarvis could tell, and none of them had said anything, which Tony and Jarvis both appreciated. Better, the ones who were probably harboring suspicions hadn't started acting weird, which, given the prevalence of self-aware computers are evil in media of all descriptions, was a real concern. Good evening, Your Majesty, Master, General, Jarvis said. All 3 dwarves went a bit wide-eyed and glanced around for the source of the voice. For once, Tony suspected the surprise was of the usual sort. It wasn't, I didn't know such a thing was possible, so much as, I wasn't expecting this here of all places. Which made sense, since Thargeen mentioned that strongly magical items tended to develop minds of their own. They'd be used to a source of intelligence that wasn't a person, but not expecting to find such a thing on Midgard. I am, as indicated, Jarvis. I am a technical construct capable of instantaneous observation and communication anywhere inside this building. I have access to the vast majority of Midgardian knowledge and will be more than happy to assist you in whatever ways you require, so long as those ways cause no harm to any residents of the building, Jarvis told them. It was a very simplified explanation, since none of the other realms had computers, and explaining those and the internet, not to mention explaining Jarvis's full capabilities, would take quite a while. But even the short and simplified explanation had all 3 dwarves giving Tony knowing, respectful looks. I do not know how you manage such a thing without magic, Razdan said, but imbuing something with a consciousness of its own. Thargeen and Campana both looked like they agreed with the remainder of whatever Razdan had been about to say. Tony tried very hard not to be inseparably smug. He was self-aware enough to know it wasn't really working. Jarvis is one of a kind, Tony admitted, though I do have a few much less sophisticated constructs with more limited forms of awareness. He was never going to fess up to the fact that he didn't quite know how Jarvis had made the leap from programmed AI to person, nor that he sincerely doubted he'd be able to repeat the feat even if he wanted to. Which he didn't. He'd struck gold the first time. Who knew what would happen if he tried for Jarvis Mark II? Now, I don't know how you guys measure time, what time it was on your ship, or if you keep track of days versus night, Tony said, which, given they lived deep underground or in space for the most part, a few farmers and fishermen aside, keeping track of day versus night was probably a moot point, but is very, very early in the morning here. Normally, the majority of people aren't up and about and doing things for at least 4 more hours, and most folks call it a day as of about 2 hours ago. Tony wasn't going to bother to explain about night shifts because the dwarves really didn't need to know that level of detail yet. They just needed to know that for most things they wanted to do or see, they needed to know the rough times that those things would be available. We work on a 24-hour clock. Most people divide it into 2 12-hour segments, so you'll hear people say things like, it's 3 o'clock, or what have you. We also divide the planet into, wedges. Each wedge has its own hour. So for this wedge, it's 2 in the morning. But for the wedges on either side of us, it's an hour earlier or later. Tony told him. Of course, it was more complicated than that. The border lines for the time zones could get really weird, but wedges worked as a simplified explanation. So if you have a meeting in some place in a different wedge, you have to take the time difference into account, which would very probably come up. Thurgen nodded. Understood. What is our itinerary? Today is just for hanging out at the tower, getting you 3 acclimated, and at least started on being on the same sleep/awake schedule as the rest of us, since you're going to be here for a few weeks. Tomorrow, we've got an appointment at a hydroponics farm in the morning. Day after that, we meet up with some potential crews for the ships. All of them also folks who can help bang out a basic design for the ships, and give them the down low on what's coming, and what they'll be able to do to help, if they're game. Tony told him. I figure most of the rest of the time will be spent working on schematics and the like, since it'll take a bit to figure out something that'll work well, given our inexperience with this sort of craft. It'll also give you time to get a gander at what Midgard has to offer if the hydroponics don't pan out. If you want to meet some of the planet-based offenders, we can easily arrange that while you're here. Tony left shortly after that and headed for his own bed. The next few days were going to be hectic and interesting. The odds were high that this visit would be the one to blow the whole "guess what the Avengers are doing" can of worms open were insanely high. Someone, somewhere, was bound to notice that a couple of their sub and or astronaut crews, ostensibly on leave, had taken off for parts unknown. It wouldn't, even with Jarvis running interference, take too terribly much to figure out where the crews had gone. From there, anyone with a modicum of intelligence would add 2 and 2 and come up with 4. Tony snorted a laugh. Government and or military stooges being smart enough to add 2 and 2 and get 4? Why was he worrying again? That was never going to happen. Or, 1 or 2 individuals in those establishments might come up with 4, but they'd then be faced with a daunting task of helping their fellows come up with that sum so that they could try to do something about the situation. In which case, Tony had little to nothing to worry about, because if there was one thing he'd learned in his days as a weapons maker, it was that government and military officials could be frighteningly stupid.